And we all must search. We must search for what is truth.
What is truth?
Truth is
just that's a really hard question. What is truth?
There has to be a fixed truth, in my opinion, for the universe to function properly.
What is truth?
And the lonely voice of youth cries, what is...
Hello and welcome to What is Truth? I'm your host, Dave Glander, and today is my birthday and I'm sick as a dog, so we've got kind of an interesting little day that I've had. It hasn't exactly been the birthday of choice, brothery, I can tell you that much, but I thank God for all the stuff that's going on in my life that I think I've just worked myself down. So to all of you out there who have wished me a happy birthday on Facebook, thank you. I don't know how many there are, but there's way too many to keep up with, and I will try and respond back to each one of them individually, but I may just have to do what everybody else does and do a blanket thank you out there, but thank you anyways. Today I've got on my show Dan Wallace, who's a professor of New Testament studies at Dallas Theological Seminary, where he has taught New Testament Greek for more than a quarter of a century. He's also the executive director of the Center for Study of New Testament Manuscripts, which is a nonprofit institute dedicated to taking digital photographs of all surviving Greek New Testament manuscripts and posting them online for free so that scholars may access and research them. It's quite an enormous task. There's 2.6 million pages of text to photograph. In its first 10 years of existence, CSNTM staff have discovered 70 Greek New Testament manuscripts, more than all other institutes and individuals combined have discovered in the same time frame. As an internationally known Greek New Testament scholar, Dan Wallace has been a consultant for 4 Bible translations, the ESV, TNIV, NKJV, and the NET. He has also contributed articles to the ESV Study Bible and the Holman Christian Standard Bible. Dan is one of those guys that you can just keep on reading and reading and reading. At the bottom line is we're going to be talking about, is the Bible reliable, and specifically is the New Testament reliable? Dan, you with us today?
I am, and I'm sorry that you're having such a lousy day on your birthday, but it's good to be on your show.
You know what, Dan? It's funny. You know, there's that old saying: if you pray for patience, God just might give you something to be patient.
Yeah.
And so I've been praying, okay, God, I need a little bit of R&R. And when you're sick, running a fever and everything else, you kind of get that R&R. So it's not exactly the R&R you were thinking of, but it's right. It's there nonetheless. Dan, thank you so much for coming on today. This subject that we're going to be talking about today is actually one that's near and dear to my heart. As we all do as apologists, I think we run into quite a few atheists out there, get into a lot of different debates, a lot of different conversations. Just even on the job site around the quote-unquote water cooler, we have a lot of different conversations about the Bible, and the most common thing that ever comes up, and what I really want to answer tonight is this: how do we know what the original authors wrote is what we have now? How do we know it's not the game of telephone? And so what I want to kind of do is just start with something that's known as textual criticism, and why is it necessary for the New Testament?
It's a very, very important topic, and there's so many skeptics out there that are now really convincing people that we have no clue what the original New Testament said when people haven't examined any of the data. So I think this is a good discussion, a good topic for us to deal with this hour.
Absolutely.
I'll define what textual criticism is to begin with. The word criticism is not a term that's used with reference to ancient historical documents like the New Testament in a sense of being subjectively critical, always picking on it. Yeah. What it means is examining it under scientific scrutiny. And so textual criticism has to do with trying to determine the wording of the original of a document whose original is now gone. We have to do this for virtually all ancient literature, including the New Testament. And consequently, textual criticism means let's try to figure out what the original New Testament actually said, since we no longer have the original New Testament.
Absolutely. What is a textual variant before we move on?
Well, the textual variant is that unit that we are considering where we've got differences among these manuscripts. So, for example, if you have in, say, John chapter 4, verse 1, it either says Jesus or it says the Lord. And it's like when Jesus knew that the Pharisees had heard that he had been baptizing and making more disciples than John, or when the Lord knew. And so you've got a textual variant there between Jesus and the Lord in Greek, and the difference in wording is considered a variant. Now, if you have, let's say you've got 500 manuscripts that have the word Jesus and 1,000 that have the word Lord there, that still counts just as one textual variant. It's a very important point. There have been some evangelical apologists who have said, well, if you've got 500 manuscripts that say Lord, then that counts as 500 textual variants. That is not true. That's been a myth that has been promoted in popular circles actually since 1965. So textual variant is any place where the wording differs among the manuscripts, and even down to the very spelling. So most of these variants are of so minor consequence you can't even translate them, but that's the basic idea.
Gotcha. So when you just said that, you actually said something that I think is so profound in the world of criticism against the Bible, that we actually don't have any New Testament manuscripts anymore. Doesn't that mean that we have no idea what they said?
Well, we don't have the original. We do have New Testament manuscripts, but no originals. And so,
and when you say original, we mean like from the pen of the hand that the person that wrote them. We don't have any. Doesn't that just kind of start and stop right there as a conversation stopper?
Well, if you did that, then we'd immediately go back into the Dark Ages because we don't have the originals of virtually any ancient Greco-Roman literature as well.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, the Renaissance was started when Greek scribes really fled from Constantinople on May 29th, 1453, when the Turks invaded the city, and it became a Muslim fortress after that point. But they fled into Western Europe with their Greek manuscripts, and both the Renaissance and the Reformation were born because of that. Now, that means that Greek learning came back into vogue. People started looking at ancient Greek. There had not been any university in all of Western Europe that taught ancient Greek until 1458 at the University of Paris for the first time.
Was it basically a dead language?
Well, the ancient Greek is significantly different from the modern language enough that it was not considered a live option. That's correct. And even Greeks, for the most part, living Greeks in Greece and Turkey, didn't communicate that much with the rest of Western Europe. So when these manuscripts were brought by the scribes into Western Europe, then the Renaissance and the Reformation could take place because people really examined some of the data that had been in these documents for centuries, and we got out of the Dark Ages because of it. And yet, we didn't see the original documents of any of the ancient Greco-Roman authors, but that moved us out of the Dark Ages. There are forces today, believe it or not, at universities that want us to move back into the Dark Ages by being so skeptical about the New Testament and other ancient literature that they just throw up their hands and say, we have no idea what it said back then, and so we might as well just chuck the whole endeavor.
Wow. Now, how many of the manuscripts still exist today as far as the extant manuscripts? I mean, if that's what we have to go on, do we have a lot there?
We actually do have a great number of manuscripts for the New Testament. In fact, it's far more than any other documents we have of ancient literature. We have, the latest count is over 5,600 New Testament manuscripts. Now, a lot of these are fragmentary, especially the early ones, but the average-sized New Testament manuscript is over 450 pages long. It's got quite a substantial amount of material, and as you mentioned in the beginning of the program, there are more than 2.6 million pages of text to photograph, so it's great job security for me at the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts to do this, because we've only done a drop in the bucket. We have a long, long way to go.
How many have you made it through, just for curiosity?
We've photographed nearly 400 manuscripts. But, we've been in existence for 10 years, and yet at the same time, it's been difficult to raise the funds because it requires raising awareness of what this is about. And this is a mission that is absolutely vital both to Christians, and it should be vital to even those who are non-Christians who are interested in the origins of the Christian faith. What is it that the original New Testament said? And that's our ultimate task, to produce the data so scholars can access it.
Well, it's an interesting point you raise, and actually I wonder, in your field, do you see the secularist paying any mind at all to the biblical text as a historical document? Not necessarily as the Word of God as we think of it. Do they want to see these translated accurately so that they can have a historical document in their hands?
Well, I would say 15 years ago, I'd say yes, everybody is significantly interested in that. Nowadays, as we're moving more into postmodernism, there's kind of a subtle shift that is happening in higher education, and it's happening with reference to ancient historical documents as well as literature. And that is, there's more of an interest in terms of how it was transmitted along the lines of, well, we've got scribes in the 2nd century and 3rd and 4th century, and they treat the text this way, they change it. That's just as fascinating to them as the original text. But the reality is that we should be primarily interested in trying to recover the wording of the original documents of all these things. I mean, I don't want to have some diluted copy of the Gettysburg Address or of the preamble to the Constitution. I want to know what the original text actually says.
Well, let's talk about that then. How in the world are we going to know what the original text said if we don't have any of the original manuscripts?
Well, let me again make the comparison back to the classical text, the Greco-Roman text. If we don't have the original manuscripts of the New Testament, we need to admit we also don't have the original manuscripts of the other literature.
Okay.
Consequently, if that's what we're dealing with, how do these two compare? And the New Testament, on average, has more than 1,000 times more material than the average classical author has in terms of the copies that remain today. It's absolutely stunning. So if we're going to be skeptical about recovering the wording of the original New Testament, then we have to be 1,000 times more skeptical about the average classical author. That's just a stunning fact that even when I've debated skeptics on this, they have to admit, yes, that's true. And then they say, however, we're still going to be skeptical. Well, if you're going to be that skeptical, let's just go right back into the Dark Ages. Let's just chuck all ancient history, because now we know next to nothing about what happened in the past. We don't know if there was a Plato or Aristotle, or we don't know anything about Augustus Caesar and all the rest of the Caesars. And so much of ancient history is just simply gone to us, except for inscriptions on stone and coins, and that's about all we've got.
Well, see, and I want to continue on into the documents themselves, but to me, when I hear you talking about that, it kind of scares me a little bit, because as I'm noticing, there's a shift in people who say we can't know history at all. And so when you're saying if we have to question everything else, it seems they're just throwing their hands in the air and saying, exactly, that's what I'm saying, that you can't know history at all. History becomes relative depending on the one who's studying it, what they want to extract according to their worldview. How do you defend that position? Let me ask you that. Do you run into that position where you're saying if we question the historicity of the Bible, we're going to have to do that with every ancient document? And do you run into this mindset of, well, exactly, that's what I'm saying, we have to question all history?
Yeah, and that's the troubling fact. I think that's from the rise of postmodernism, especially, that there gets to be such a massive skepticism about the past. But I'm trying to give warnings to people, and others are doing the same thing, that if we take that route, we will go right back into the Dark Ages. We might as well just say all the learning that we've had for the last 500 years since the Reformation began, we'll kiss it goodbye.
Wow.
It's irrelevant, not just for the Reformation, but for the Renaissance, for all of modern science, which has its basis going back to Galen, and modern politics, which goes back to the Athenians, our modern government, which goes back to the Romans. All that is based on, according to these people, something we have no clue of, so we might as well scrap it and start over.
Yeah, and which totally throws in the garbage can the do not let history repeat itself by learning from history.
Right.
If you have any questions or comments and you want to call in, the number is 678-963-5482. Once again, the call-in number with any questions or comments is 678-963-5482, or you can go to What is Truth Radio Show with Dave Glander on Facebook, hit the like button, and go ahead and ask your questions on there, and we can, if you don't want to get your voice on the air, we can answer your questions that way as well. But that number is 678-963-5482. Well, when since we don't have any of the original manuscripts, we have such an abundance of the extant manuscripts. When were they written, and do we have any early ones? Any early manuscripts?
That's where the New Testament shines even better, I think, than when you compare just the numbers of manuscripts with other ancient literature. We actually have manuscripts as early as within 100 years of the time that the New Testament was written. In fact, we have, I would have said a couple months ago, we have as many as a dozen manuscripts written within a century of when the New Testament was completed. But now there have been some recent discoveries that are going to be published in about a year, and we now have as many as 18 that are written within a century of the New Testament.
Wow.
Not only that, but this is the really exciting news, and this is what I revealed in my debate with my most recent debate with Dr. Bart Ehrman at UNC Chapel Hill, where he teaches. He's a world-renowned textual critic and a very strong skeptic of the New Testament. I mentioned there, this is on February 1st, that we now have a first-century fragment of Mark's Gospel.
Wow.
And that is huge news.
Where did that come from? I'm just curious about that. I didn't know that.
All of these are papyri that had to survive in very, very dry climates, and almost all of our papyri come from Egypt in places that are above the water table where they've been excavating for over a century. And so I'm not at liberty yet to say exactly where it came from, but this is going to make some massive news because we've never had a first-century manuscript of the New Testament. The earliest we had before was Papyrus 52, which was discovered in 1934. And the reason for the number 52 is as these New Testament papyri are discovered, they're just numbered sequentially.
Yeah.
So this fragment of Mark's Gospel has not been numbered yet because it hasn't been published yet. It'll, as I said, it'll be published in a multi-author book coming out in about a year from now. And so this is a manuscript that would have been written before the New Testament was completed. That
is fascinating. That's mine. Yeah, that's why I had to kind of pause and stop and ask that because I'm personally blown away. I had never heard of a manuscript dating back to the first century.
Well, I never thought we'd be able to find one, but there's some new techniques that are being used to discover these manuscripts, and I'm very excited about this, and even hopeful that we might find another one or two that are from the first century.
How do, just for curiosity, how do they go about a dating technique on a piece of papyri?
Well, what you do with dating is called paleography, which has to do with analyzing ancient writing, and there's a number of techniques that are used, but let me give a broad parameter to start with, and we'll get into the details.
Okay.
For example, the first thing that you look at least with reference to biblical manuscripts, is are they written with capital letters or are they written in a cursive or a minuscule hand?
Okay.
If it's capital letters, then it has to be a first millennium AD manuscript. If it's cursive, that starts in the 9th century on. So there's a little bit of overlap. So that's a big, broad parameter on it. And then you start looking at some other details, like what's called ligatures becomes a very important issue. A ligature is when you combine two letters so they're sharing at least one line. For example, in older books, you'll read the British spelling of archaeology, A-R-C-H-A-E, and so the A and the E together have the same line in books that are written 60, 70 years ago. You won't see that anymore, but that's a ligature. And so if someone were to pick up a book that had the line like that, they'd say, oh, this must have been written in the 1960s or earlier if they knew anything about English font. And we all practice this, even though we're novices at it, when it comes to regular documents. If you go to the National Archives building in Washington, D.C., and you see, say, the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, you'll look at the handwriting and you'll say, well, that's a funny way to put a final S.
Yeah.
I mean, it looks like an F.
Yeah.
Well, we just don't do that. You'd say, I know this wasn't written in the 20th century.
Absolutely.
And so people have a good sense like that, but when you have dated manuscripts, this is really the key. When you have actual dated manuscripts out there, where someone says, I'm writing to Timaeus, my son, on the battlefield in the 3rd year of Augustus Caesar, something like that. Well, we can fix the date of that handwriting because of that external reference. And you have that dated manuscript, you look at the various letters, the ligatures, how they're formed, the size of the letters, whether they're indented, outdented. There's so many factors that paleographers look at. And then you say, these are all features that we see in this manuscript that's dated at this time. Then you start looking at a number of other manuscripts that are dated, and it gives you the parameters of, we start seeing that this letter changes its look in about 150, and then at about 225 it's completed. No manuscripts after 225 will look like this. So that helps us. We plug those dated manuscripts in, and then we compare the undated manuscripts to the ones that are dated, and we get a pretty good sense of how the writing changed over the centuries and when it happened.
And that makes me feel a whole lot better, because if it was radiocarbon dating, I have a real problem with that. So I'm glad to see that, just like in archaeology, they go in strata levels, and the artistry of the pottery, or the way that a handle's bent, and it signifies a certain time period. And I'm very happy to hear that the way that it's identified is because of the way that writing styles have changed. Let's say we could somehow wipe out all existing New Testament manuscripts. Would we have any idea what the New Testament originally said?
Yeah, if somebody could just wave a magic wand and wipe out every single New Testament manuscript we've got, we still be able to reconstruct virtually the entire New Testament from ancient documents that are not New Testament manuscripts. And let me clarify this. I mentioned we have about 5,600 Greek New Testament manuscripts. That's not all the existing New Testament manuscripts. The New Testament was early on translated into a variety of languages, from Latin to Syriac and Coptic, Armenian, Arabic, Old Church Slavonic, you name it. There's just Georgian and Gothic, all sorts of languages it was translated into. And we have over 20,000 manuscripts of the New Testament in Greek and these various languages.
Wow.
So if we were to wipe out all of those, we still could reconstruct virtually the entire New Testament on the basis of quotations of the New Testament by church fathers. Church fathers were ancient scholars. They were bishops and elders of churches and leaders of the Christian community, and they wrote both homilies or sermons and commentaries on the New Testament. And there's a place in Boiron, Germany, that has been cataloging this for decades. And a few years ago, they hit over 1 million quotations from the New Testament by the church fathers.
Oh, my goodness. Wow. 1 million?
Mm-hmm. So
that has to be a record
they're still
setter.
going. I mean, they haven't finished their work yet. There's quite a bit more to do.
Is that setting records somehow? I mean, of the most quoted book in history or something? I mean, that's got to be.
I'm quite sure that's the case, yes.
Yeah, I mean, my goodness, that is a ton. So let's just kind of catch up to where we are. We don't have any of the original manuscripts, but what we do have is an abundance of early extant manuscripts. And if I just heard you right, you said over 20,000 when you take into consideration all of the different languages that are involved. And not only do we have all of that, but it's been quoted so many times that if we were to destroy all the original, or not the original, but the early manuscript, we would still be able to put the New Testament together.
Right, and we need to clarify, it's not just early manuscripts. Those 20,000 cover all the centuries of when handwritten manuscripts were produced, before the time of the printing press, basically.
Absolutely. Let's do this. How does the New Testament stack up against other Greco-Roman literature in terms of number of surviving manuscripts? What is that? What would that look? Can you give us some sort of? I'm a very visual learner. Mm-hmm. Is there some sort of a visual illustration you could give us that would kind of put that into context for us?
As I mentioned, the average classical author has 1,000th, not even 1,000th amount of material as the New Testament does. But if we could do this way, if you take that average classical author, and I've mentioned this in debates with skeptics about it, and they don't have any refutation for it. They know this is a true fact. The average classical author, at most, has about 20 copies of his writings that still exist. If you were to stack those up, they'd be about 4 feet high. Now, you stack up all these New Testament manuscripts in all the ancient languages, just like we would for classical authors. But we don't count the quotations from the Church Fathers. I have no idea how to stack up 1 million quotations.
Yeah, no kidding.
But just the manuscripts, 4 feet high for the classical author, over 1 mile high of material for the New Testament.
What?
Yeah, it's absolutely a massive difference.
So 4 foot versus over 1 mile.
Right. The problem that New Testament textual critics have is not that we can't access the original text. It's that we have an embarrassment of riches, and we have so much material, and we need a lot more workers to go through it to be sure what the original is. But most New Testament scholars would say, we don't ever have to come up with conjecture, that is, guessing what the original text said, without having manuscript evidence for it. That's not true for other ancient languages. Other ancient literature.
How could that be an embarrassment, though? I mean, at this point, we've got hundreds of years. I mean, we can say easily more than that, but hundreds of years of scholars sitting there, putting hours upon hours upon hours upon hours of working on the translations and getting textual variants worked out and stuff. So even though we haven't gone through them all, it doesn't seem that it would be it doesn't seem like it would hurt the case to have extra to say, okay, we haven't reached over here yet.
I don't mean embarrassment in that sense. I mean embarrassment of riches in the sense that, gee, if you're a New Testament textual critic, you've got so much wealth of material to deal with that you're embarrassed by it compared to the poor fellow who's having to work with some classical text where there's only one copy that comes 1,200 years after the original guy wrote.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that leads me to the second one. How does it stack up against the other ancient Greco-Roman literature in terms of date of the surviving manuscripts?
Well, that again is where I think the New Testament really shines well. We have more copies of the New Testament within the first 300 years after the New Testament was completed that still exist today than we do for the average Greco-Roman author in 2,000 years of copying.
Wow.
Not only do we have more copies in those first 300 years, but we have about 4 or 5 times as many copies in those first 300 years as the average Greco-Roman author has in the whole time it's been copied. And not only that, but the average Greco-Roman author, we're waiting half a millennium or more before we get any copies at all. 500 years.
Wow.
In that first 500 years, the New Testament has got far, far more copies than the average Greco-Roman author will ever have. And here's the thing that's significant, and I think this is good for anybody listening to this to grasp. Skeptics will always say, well, yeah, you may have a lot of manuscripts of the New Testament, but 85% of them come after AD 1000. And so they say, well, so therefore, you're not dealing with that many. Well, they're making a comparison that is a relative comparison. If you talk about 85% after 1000, you're still dealing with hundreds of New Testament manuscripts in the first millennium, and nothing else compares to that except for Homer.
Yeah.
Homer has an 800-year or 900-year head start on the New Testament, and it still doesn't come close to the New Testament by a long shot in terms of the number of copies or even how close they are to the original.
Well, that's. I mean, you bring up a good point that I've heard a lot, where it's if there's that much of a time gap between there, and I know you talked about having one manuscript actually show up that was within the first century, but if most of these are located second, third, fourth, fifth, and then getting 85% past the 1000s, then doesn't that allow time for mythology to have worked their way in there? Couldn't they just kind of mysticize Christ instead of really telling us what we needed to know about him?
Well, certainly. When you think in terms of, could they have done this? Yes, they could have. Did they do this? No, they didn't. And you say, well, where's the evidence? Well, just look at a 2nd century manuscript, a 3rd century, and compare it to a 12th century or 15th century. We actually have, from our earliest manuscripts and the best reconstruction that scholars have done today in terms of saying this is what we believe the original New Testament actually said, to the latest form of the text, which ironically enough is found basically in the King James translation of the Bible.
Uh-huh.
We have a growth of 2% over those 1,500 years of copying.
2% what?
That means the New Testament itself has only grown 2% over 1,500 years.
Wow.
If you're going to add myth and things like this, you'd expect to have whole Gospels completely rewritten and have lots of extra stories. We really don't have lots of extra stories. We have, to be quite frank, 2 extra stories in the New Testament that were added in later centuries. And most scholars would say these are not authentic. They're 12 verses each, and one's at the end of Mark's Gospel and one's in the middle of John's Gospel. But apart from those, the next longest segment that was added is only 2 verses.
What is the response to just, for instance, the end of Mark's Gospel? What is the response to somebody who brings that up and says it wasn't in the earliest manuscripts? I mean, what do we say? Do we say, okay, let's just not consider those, or is there enough manuscript evidence for them being in there that we would say maybe somehow it skipped some of the earliest ones, or that we don't have the earliest copies? What is the response to that?
Well, actually, I believe that Mark intended to end his gospel at chapter 16, verse 8, where the angel announces to the women, you need to go and tell the disciples that Jesus is risen from the dead, and they hid because they were afraid, and that's the end of the gospel. Verses 9 through 20 are about, it goes on, then it says, and on the first day, Mary goes to the tomb and sees Jesus. You go, wait a minute, we already had the first day, what's going on here? and that's found in the majority of manuscripts, verses 9 through 20. And that's the section that talks about picking up snakes and drinking poison and not getting hurt and that kind of thing. And I think those 12 verses are verses that a lot of Christians would say, boy, if there's any one section I'd like to cut out of my Bible, it would be that, because that just looks like the West Virginia snake handlers, you know, and their denomination. And by the way, people should Google this. Look up West Virginia snake handler denominations. You'll see some videos that are just absolutely horrifying, and how it's based on that one passage that is not part of the original.
I've seen those videos. I'm not sure whether I should laugh or cry. I mean, I kind of laugh at everything, so I kind of start laughing, but the other part of me goes, no, pray for him, man, pray for him. Yeah, so
that's very sad. But here's the thing that's significant is, in the early centuries, you had the church father Eusebius, who had access to a great deal of manuscripts, because he was commissioned by Emperor Constantine to put together 50 Bibles. Once Constantine became a Christian, he said, I want 50 Bibles for the empire in Greek to be put in the major churches. So Eusebius was commissioned to put these together. And what's significant, this is early 4th century, he says, I've looked at these the ends of Mark's Gospel, and in the vast majority of manuscripts that I have looked at, those verses 9 through 20 are not found in these manuscripts. The earliest and the best manuscripts don't have them. And then nearly a century later, you had Jerome, who was commissioned by the Pope to put it together for the Latin Bible. So you've got the Greek Bible, which was in Eastern Europe, the Latin Bible, which was in Western Europe, all within a century of each other. And Jerome has access to a great deal of resources, and he says virtually the same thing as Eusebius. And he says, I just can't find this in the manuscripts. The vast majority of them don't have the long ending. So what we have today in our manuscripts is the vast majority of them do have the long ending, which means that what was in the majority in the early centuries now has become a minority in later centuries.
So what do we do with it?
Well, I would say, in light of the evidence that we've got, we would have to say those verses are not authentic, and that Mark did not write them, and that he intended to end his gospel at chapter 16, verse 8. And you say, well, that seems kind of like a downer, but here's what I think he's doing. I think Mark was trying to write an open-ended gospel. And the first time he mentions about, quoting Jesus saying, the Son of Man has to suffer and die, and on the third day, or after 3 days, rise from the dead. He says that in Mark 8. The disciples get really upset about that, and Peter rebukes him. And then in Mark 9, after the transfiguration, Jesus says it again. And the next sentence says, now the disciples were scratching their heads wondering, what did he mean by the resurrection? They didn't have a clue what that was all about. And then they said, but nobody dared to ask him, for they were afraid. And that story stops right there. Then Mark goes on to the next one. It's an open-ended story to say, well, I'm not going to tell you the rest of this. And then again, you have the same prophecy in the next chapter. Well, you get to the end of Mark's Gospel, you expect to see the risen Christ appear to the disciples, and he doesn't. And at the same time, we know that he's risen. The angel says that he's risen. The angel tells the women Jesus has been raised from the dead. And so all this way through, we're expecting to see Jesus, after he's crucified, rise from the dead, and we don't get to see it. And Mark is essentially saying, put yourself in the place of the disciples. What are you going to do with Jesus? If you want to accept him in his glory, you must follow him in his suffering. And the disciples, at least in Mark 8, were unwilling to do that. And that's why Peter rebuked him. His idea of, we believe that you're the Christ, the Son of God, is we want a conquering hero that can kick some Roman butt and kick them out of Jerusalem. And so Mark is saying, and what Jesus is saying is, that's not the kind of Messiah I am. If you want to follow me, take up your cross and follow me daily.
Interesting.
So Mark's gospel is really an open invitation for somebody to become a Christian and to follow Jesus in the sense of recognizing that discipleship, true discipleship, involves suffering.
That is very interesting. Can you give me an example of what a really important textual variant is?
Well, yeah, besides the Mark 16 one, which is, I think, the perhaps the most important large textual variant, we have the other large one, which is John chapter 7, verses 53 through 8:11. That's the story of the woman caught in adultery. And both of these passages, by the way, are printed in virtually all of our Bibles. And yet in the marginal notes, you'll see in most Bibles, or you'll see them in brackets or something like that, they'll say, not found in the earliest manuscripts. And that's all they say about it. Well, if you ask those editors of those translations, they would give you an earful about what they also thought about those passages. That is, they're not found in the earliest manuscripts. They don't fit into the style of the author. The church fathers don't comment on them for quite some time, and it disrupts the narrative. They'd say, these passages are not authentic.
Well, why are they in there?
Well, they're in there first because when the what's known as the Textus Receptus was first published, that's the first Greek New Testament ever printed on a printing press, and it was done by Erasmus of Rotterdam in 1516. That came out then, and those two passages were in the late manuscripts that he had access to, so he put them in. And then that became kind of a traditional text that went its way through 3 different editors until the King James translators got a hold of it, and it became a fixed part of the text in the King James Bible. Until 1475, we were not aware of any Greek manuscripts that didn't have the long ending of Mark. But frankly, there's quite a few manuscripts, about 20% of them, and most of the earlier ones, that don't have the story of the woman caught in adultery. So what's happened over the centuries is we've gotten to the place where we now have what I would call a tradition of timidity. Translators put this in because if you leave them out, then they're not going to sell Bibles. And it's a really difficult decision. They want to make sure it's not just a mercenary decision. It's more than that, because there was actually a Bible produced in England where they put these 2 passages at the end of the Gospels, and there was just a huge outcry, so they put them back in.
What was the first translation that really put them in there that started this whole thing?
Well, it would probably have been, in terms of English, it would have been Tyndale's translation. Well, the Wycliffe Bible did it too, but Wycliffe was done by hand, handwritten in the 1380s.
Yeah.
The Tyndale, which came out in the 1520s and 1530s, 2 different editions had it. And that is kind of one of the ancestors before the King James.
So as early as the English translations, it's been in there.
Yeah. But here's the interesting thing, is that if you ask the average Christian, if you had to choose just one of these 2 passages to stay in your Bible and you kick out the other one, almost everybody would say, well, I want the story of the woman caught in adultery in my Bible because it shows the compassion and grace and mercy and forgiveness of our Lord.
Yeah.
And I don't want the other one because you get the West Virginia snake handlers from that one. And so what's interesting, though, is although that's what we would say, the evidence for the story of the woman caught in adultery is paltry compared to the evidence for the long ending of Mark's Gospel. And I already argued that the long ending of Mark's Gospel really should not be in there. I think there's significant evidence to argue against it.
So what you're saying is the story of the woman caught in adultery, there's so little early manuscript evidence for that it's almost a shame, if you will, that it's in there at all.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I agree. And it's I would call it my favorite passage that's not in the Bible.
I do love that passage. I mean, I must admit, it's a great passage.
Yeah.
I've heard that before. I've never heard it quite put at that level where it's there's so little evidence for it that it really is. It kind of makes you scratch your head and say, how did this end up in there in the first place? If you have any questions or comments, 678-963-5482. Once again, that number is 678-963-5482. Or you can go to What Is Truth Radio Show with Dave Glander on Facebook. Hit the like button there, and you can submit your questions online. What really is at stake? I mean, is the deity of Christ on the line, or the virgin birth? Are there any passages that dispute that? I mean, those are the real doctrinal issues that we're looking at. Are there any textual variants? Is there any differences between translations throughout the years that really just hurts the case for Christianity?
That really is the bottom line question. You've got to the nub of this that all of us are really concerned about. We want to know, is the Bible that we have in our hands the same as what the apostles and their associates and the prophets really wrote? And here's what I can say, and I can say this very dogmatically because I can even get skeptics to fully agree with it. There is not a single essential Christian belief that is on the line when it comes to these textual variants. Not one. The deity of Christ is absolutely secure. The virgin birth is absolutely secure. The resurrection of Jesus is secure. The Trinity is secure. None of these doctrines are in any way in any jeopardy at all because of the textual variants. And in the 3 debates that I've had with Dr. Bart Ehrman, who's really the best skeptic out there against what the original New Testament said and how much the doctrine has been changed, he has had to admit, because he has put it in writing himself, that no essential Christian belief is affected by any of these variants. And the irony is you get Muslims and you get atheists who have camped on what Ehrman has written in his books, and they seem to have overlooked that one statement that he makes at the end of misquoting Jesus. And in other words, they're saying, well, you Christians have invented the deity of Christ, and typically they'll say, well, it was invented when Constantine became the emperor. Well, I can show you a dozen manuscripts that have the deity of Christ clearly affirmed long before Constantine ever lived. So those kinds of things are just really silly. And for us to recognize this is extremely helpful for Christians. No essential belief is affected by any of these variants.
Not the story of the resurrection, not the story of the virgin birth. I mean, in all of the differences that can be found. I mean, because I heard there's more differences, more textual variants in the manuscripts than there are in the original New Testament, and none of those are affecting the basis of the Christian doctrine.
That's correct, and let me just elaborate on that a little bit, because again, you hear this sometimes. There's more variants than there are words in the original Testament. As you said, this is a line that Bart Ehrman has essentially coined and made famous, and he's absolutely right. We have about 138,000 words in the Greek New Testament, and we have at least twice as many textual variants as we do those words. And I think the number is close to 400,000, so it's about 2.5 times the variants that we have for the words in the original New Testament. But you say, well, then there's no way to get back to the original. Well, again, a variant is any place where there's any wording difference, even down to the spelling, even down to the word order. And let me give an illustration here. Greek is a highly inflected language, and you can put Greek in a number of different word orders where it means the same thing, though the emphasis might be slightly different. Not only is it highly inflected, but it also uses the article, the word the, in a way that English doesn't. So I can say, the Jesus loves the Paul. And Greek would have that, but we never translate it that way.
Uh-huh.
And so when you start thinking about how many ways can you say Jesus loves Paul in Greek using exactly the same word for Jesus, loves, and Paul each time, there's at least 16 different ways you can say that in Greek, and every time it's translated exactly the same.
Okay.
Now, if you add some different spellings or variants in terms of the verb itself, or even particles, there's small words of Greek that typically don't get translated, the number gets into the hundreds. And recently I recalculated, and I think it's over 1,100 ways you can say Jesus loves Paul. Where in translation,
1,100 different ways.
1,100 different ways. And so if you've got the potential, literally, of tens of millions of textual variants for the New Testament before anything is affected, to have 400,000 is just a drop in the bucket. And when I say, you just don't have the major doctrines affected, let's look at the details. That makes it pretty obvious. 99%, actually over 99% of all the textual variants that we have virtually affect nothing. The vast majority of them can't be translated. The most common textual variant is one of spelling, and the most common spelling variant is where you have what's called a movable nu at the end of a word. A movable nu is just like an N at the end of a word when the next word starts with a vowel. So it's like our A book, an apple, that kind of a thing. And in Greek, the movable nu is the most common variant. It's so common, textual critics typically don't count it. But it doesn't affect anything.
Well, I remember a study with two scholars, and I can't remember. You probably know who they are right offhand, but they came up with a 98.8% purity rating on the translation, meaning there was a 1.2% factor of error, and most of that was dedicated to actual spelling variants more than anything. Do you remember that study? And is that a true study?
There are 2 or 3 studies that have come up with numbers that are like that. One of them I think is accurate, or pretty accurate, and that was done by Westcott and Hort over 100 years ago.
Yeah.
But there have been some apologists that have done that where I don't think the basis is as solid. But basically what we're boiling down to in terms of differences among scholars today, the vast majority of New Testament textual scholars would say we agree with each other on what the wording of the original text or the wording of the earliest text is in all but a few dozen places. That's it. So you get down to that and you say, gee, that's not much at all. I mean, really, what's at stake? And so you get all these variants that, like the Mark 16 variant, or probably the most famous textual variant that has confused a lot of Christians is 1 John 5:7 and 8, where in the King James it says that there are three who bear witness in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Spirit, and these three are one. But in our modern translations, it doesn't mention that at all. It says there's three who bear witness, and it's the Spirit, the water, and the blood, and these three are united. And it just has that, which the King James also has. But that reading about the Trinity, basically, you'd say, well, that's the most explicit affirmation of the Trinity in the Bible, and you guys are cutting it out of our modern translations. But the reason they do is because we can't find any ancient manuscripts. No manuscripts from the first millennium at all have that.
Yeah.
And then you get 9 manuscripts total out of the hundreds we have for 1 John that have it, and half of those have it just in a marginal reading that comes centuries later. So, we don't have any of your church fathers early on that comment on it. That's a text that every textual scholar would say, this is not authentic. We know this for sure. Even evangelical textual scholars who would say, and of course we believe in the Trinity. It's just that we can't use this verse to defend it.
Yeah, I'm going to have you come on again because you've said several things in this interview where it's just kind of struck a nerve. I just had a guy on a job site the other day telling me that he doesn't believe anything about the Bible because of the Da Vinci Code, and I just kind of cringed, and I went, I'll tell you what, I'll do a show on that just for you, and you promise you'll listen to it, or I'll put it onto a CD for you, however you want it, I'll get it into your hands. We had somebody comment online, and we'll see if we can touch on this real quick. It says, I would love to hear him explain some of the ways we distinguish between true New Testament documents and the false Gnostic Gospels.
Oh, that's a great question. Let me mention that I've co-authored a book, since you kind of hinged at this, both of the comments, that I think would satisfy the questions. It's called Reinventing Jesus. And Ed Komashevsky, James Sawyer, and I co-authored it. You're not going to be able to spell Ed Komashevsky, but if you look up Reinventing Jesus, we deal with why is it that these Gnostic Gospels and Apocryphal Gospels were not included in the canon, and what's wrong with the Da Vinci Code mentality, and how lame is it, which is unbelievably lame.
I agree.
As far as the Apocryphal Gospels, here's a very important point to catch. The religion of the Bible, Judaism and Christianity, that sacred text is the only sacred text of any major religion in the world that subjects itself to historical inquiry. The Bhagavad Gita doesn't do it, the Quran doesn't do it, the teaching of the compassionate Buddha doesn't do it. In other words, these ancient documents and apocryphal Gospels don't do it either. That's the key. That if you read, for example, the Gospel of Thomas, it will not mention a single location, not a city, nothing in there. It is talking head theology only. Well, what that means is that it could have been written any time. But when you read the New Testament, you say Jesus performed a miracle here in Capernaum, and here was the guy, and this was the day he did it, and here's the witnesses. And Paul says more than 500 believers saw the resurrected Christ at one time, most of whom are still alive. He must have either interviewed them or knew somebody who interviewed them to know this fact.
Yeah.
This is historically verifiable. And when you look at these apocryphal Gospels, they're trying to worm their way into the New Testament by mentioning the name of an apostle or a notable person. So the Gospel of Thomas starts right at the beginning, mentions Thomas. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were originally anonymous. They didn't have to do that because they're not trying to get into the New Testament. They're already part of it, But when they were written, they're just trying to write to their audiences. These apocryphal Gospels are saying, hey, it's 2nd century. There's already this text that is becoming emerging as authoritative. We need to get some books in there. And so they write these sometimes screwball books, sometimes pretty good literature, but it's not Scripture.
Yeah.
And so they don't have place names. They don't have Jesus performing miracles. It's not linked to history. And that's the thing about Christianity that is so amazing. God became man in time, space, history so that he could bring us to God himself because he is both man and God. His death could be a substitutionary atonement for us. And consequently, the Christian faith really does make itself vulnerable to historical attacks, but that's exactly what also makes it possible for somebody to believe.
Well, we just had a interview with Gary Habermas and Mike Lacona last week
on guys.
on the evidence of the death of the martyrs of the apostles, and then Mike talked a little bit about the historicity of it, and that's what I love about Christianity. Being a former atheist, when I came to Christ, I didn't come to Christ because it was the Mickey Mouse Club and it sounded good. I had to put it up to a lot of scrutiny, and it just kept standing up in the light of history. It is knowable. That's why I asked you that question earlier. When you run into people who say, "Well, we can't know any of it," you're right. Throw the baby out with the bathwater, because nothing can be known. That's a really dangerous position to put yourself in. You founded the Center for Study of New Testament Manuscripts about 10 years ago, and you're the center's executive director. Can you tell us about CSNTM and what's its mission, and how can I find out more about it?
Yeah. CSNTM, we have a website, and if people just remember Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, they can go there. Or you could just Google my name, Dan Wallace, and manuscripts, and you'll probably find it. But CSNTM.org, Charles, Stanley, Nancy, Thomas, Mother are the letters.
Okay.
And it's a website where we have posted well over 100,000 pages of Greek New Testament manuscripts in high-resolution digital images.
Wow.
And that's just a drop in the bucket. We've got over 1,000 manuscripts that we have in our archives, either that we have photographed or that we've gotten by way of microfilm or purchase. But we are making these things available so scholars can access them. Anybody can access them. So you say, gee, I've heard about this 4th century manuscript Sinaiticus. I wonder what it looks like. We'll go on our site and we'll give you the whole text.
Absolutely.
And we have discussions about a lot of things, but what I'd really like to encourage people to do is go there for 2 things. There's a section called Resources, and Resources underneath it has, if you click on that button, it has New Testament Resource Store. And we have just put up, just last week, about 300 books that are very helpful as kind of introductory texts covering all of New Testament studies, including textual criticism. So if somebody wants to know what are the best commentaries, what's the best way to get into the whole idea of the survey of the New Testament, how do I learn Greek, this kind of thing, we've got the books there, and you can just click on them and it takes you right to Amazon to order them. But the other thing I want to mention is we have a section on iTunes U, that's iTunes University, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners are going to know what that is.
Yeah.
It's primarily for 4-year educational institutes, and you really can't get into it unless by invitation otherwise. And we got invited by the vice president of education at Apple to be a part of it.
Oh, that's fantastic. Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you. And he's been a wonderful guy to work with on this. We have 50 video clips on iTunes U that are a great introduction to New Testament textual criticism, all sorts of facets. I discussed the long ending of Mark. I discussed John 8. We discussed all sorts of things, major scholars, the manuscripts, just tons of stuff on there.
Oh, that's Is it like classroom lecture style?
Yeah, although they're very brief. They're typically 2 to 15 minutes, so they're not full hour-long lectures, and it kind of wets your whistle. I want to get into more of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, listen, with all the work that you've done in consulting all the different Bible translations, in light of all that, what English? I'm almost scared to ask this question because I've run into so many people who have such a strong opinion on certain Bible translations. But you're a perfect person to ask this question to. What English Bible would you recommend for somebody to read?
I actually would recommend that for the English-speaking Christian, they need to get more than one Bible.
Hey, man, if you were here, I'd give you a high five. That's the best answer I've heard all day long. That is fantastic.
Well, we have such a great heritage and tradition, and the first translation I would recommend is the King James Bible.
Uh-huh.
It is the only literary monument ever produced by a committee.
Okay.
And it's amazing. It's 401 years old this year. But that's not going to be your principal study Bible. It's great to see our literary and religious heritage. And it's easy to memorize out of it. They intentionally made it that way.
Yeah.
In terms of modern translations, for the New Testament, I prefer the Net Bible, which is one that I was the senior editor on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one you can get at Bible.org.
Okay.
You can download the whole thing for free, in fact, if you want. But it's got more footnotes than any Bible in history.
Awesome.
Over 60,000 footnotes, and it was beta tested online. The only Bible ever done that way.
Wow.
We had over 1 million comments on it as we were putting up the files as they were going through their processes.
Good night.
And we looked at those and incorporated a number of suggestions. So it's really been exciting. But besides that, there's a couple others that I would recommend. I think the ESV overall, as a translation for Old and New Testament, is really good.
Mm-hmm.
It's memorable. It's understated elegance. And having Leland Reichen on the committee, he's an English literature professor. He really wanted to make sure that this would be kind of the 21st century equivalent of the King James, and I think that they, it's in that tradition actually.
Yeah.
The English Standard Revision, the Revised Bible, ultimately means revised from the King James Bible.
Absolutely.
So
Is that where that came from? I was wondering where that came from.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it goes all the way back to the Revised Bible of 1881, which goes back to the King James. And besides that, I'd also recommend the NIV, the new NIV. I think is a very, very good translation.
Awesome.
A different kind of translation than the ESV.
Yeah.
Not as memorable, but I think you had some extremely capable scholars who worked on it.
Accurate nonetheless.
Right.
Okay, perfect. Dan, thank you so much for coming on. As I said, I'll have to have you on again to touch on some of the more controversial issues that come up when we talk about the Bible, how we got it, and is it reliable. But I think you painted a very clear picture for anybody who is wondering if they can put their life on the line for this book. It has been documented very well. As a matter of fact, very well enough that it's keeping you and many other scholars busy as a career, just translating all of the massive amounts of manuscript evidence that we have. Thank you so much for coming on. You've been listening to What is Truth Radio on AM 1300 WIMO. This is Dave Glander. Have a great night.